The government, of course, has also today announced that cap on immigration, the permanent intake, from 190,000 down to 160,000. I spoke earlier with the Liberal Senator James Paterson about that. Senator, thanks for your time. Now, the headline figure is 190 down to 60, but we know the last completed year immigration was only about 163,000 anyway. So in terms of people on trams, trains, buses, it's business as usual, isn't it?
Well, it's not quite right, Tom, because let the system go as it was before, it's quite possible that the migration numbers would have trended up back close to that 190,000 cap each year. And of course, we know in years gone by, it's been even more than that. It's been over 200,000 in some previous financial years under the previous government. So I think it's very prudent and very sensible to set this new cap at 160,000. That balances the need to take the pressure off our major cities, which I hear about all the time from my constituents, but at the same time, make sure that there is a sufficient supply of highly skilled labour into the jobs that we need to fill, and that enough people are going to our regions where they're often crying out for more people to come.
I was interested in the one stat that Alan Tudge pulled out, being I guess former Melburnian. 39 minutes a decade ago, the average freeway travel time for a 30-kilometre trip. Now it's close to an hour. You've had coalition governments in charge for a lot of that time as well. Does it feel like a bit of a failure?
Well, I think it's fair to say, Tom, that particularly at the state level, there just hasn't been sufficient investment in infrastructure over recent decades, and yes, that's been an issue of governments of both political stripes. At the federal level, although it's not our primary responsibility, we are doing a lot in this space. $75 billion infrastructure package underway right now under this government, and we need to do our part of that. But really, state governments have to step up, and I think over the last decade or so, they have failed to do so.
As a Victorian senator, a lot of previous years, the amount of money going to Victorian infrastructure has been pulled out, and on the low side, has that been disappointing?
Look, I don't think that's a fair characterisation. I think Victoria's got a very healthy share of national infrastructure spending. Of course, it would have got even more than its share had the East-West Link proceeded as planned. The federal government still has $3 billion set aside in the government in the budget for that project to proceed if the Victorian government ever changes its mind. And we know that Infrastructure Australia, that independent, non-partisan expert advisory body in infrastructure, continues to list the East-West Link as a top priority. And anybody who's
but voters did say no on that, right? In that election, that was a big issue in that election when voters.
Well, it was one of the issues at the 2014 election, but actually most of the polls showed, Tom, that the majority of Victorians supported that. I don't think it was the decisive issue that decided the outcome of that election. But of course, you're right, the Victorian Labor government here is duly elected and can pursue whatever policies that it wishes. I just happen to think, and my federal colleagues agree, that this is a very bad decision of theirs to cancel the East-West Link contract and not to revisit it. It's going to be an issue for Melbourne in the years to come. Eventually, a state government is going to do that project. There's almost no argument about that. Infrastructure Australia keeps saying again and again and again, this has to be done. And looking at a roadmap of Melbourne, it's so obvious why it has to be done. So it's just a question of when it happens, not whether if it happens, in my view.
I'll ask you about One Nation preferences. We know Scott Morrison says no deals, but should he go further and say One Nation will be preferenced after Labor, all across the Senate, all across the lower house as well, as Labor says it will do to One Nation against coalition members and senators?
Well, I think the coalition choice, Tom, in deciding whether to put the Greens last with their extreme views and high-profile problems with anti-Semitism, and One Nation last with their reprehensible views. I think one of the factors counting against One Nation is the fact that they seem unable to pick candidates who last a term in office. Pauline Hanson was elected with 4 senators at the last election, of whom she is the only one still standing as a One Nation senator today. She's lost, remarkably, from only having 4 senators, she's lost 4 senators in that time. So we do have to be very careful about giving votes to a party that seems completely incapable of selecting its candidates carefully. Whether they're above or below Labor at the election, I think is an issue to be resolved in time. I think there's an equal test for the Labor Party. Will they preference the coalition above the Greens?
Well, Labor can continue to be asked that, but when you say that needs to be resolved, you're saying that the party should take a position and actually resolve whether or not One Nation goes after Labor and have that as an across-the-board rather than leave it up to states, for example?
Well, in the Liberal Party, Tom, local organisations determine preferences. That's how it has always been. That's how our constitution dictates it should be. It's a matter for state directors and state presidents in each state to determine preferences. But what the Prime Minister said,
but there can still be this push nationally, right, which can be led by a Prime Minister. We know they have authority to say, well, right now, given what's happening, we don't want one nation to be preferenced ahead of Labor. What's your view on whether or not that should happen?
Well, I think, Tom, the Prime Minister has taken that leadership position by saying that we'll be doing no deals with one nation, and I think that's appropriate. I think we also have to bear in mind the Labor Party are our principal political opponents. We are in a fight with them over who should be the government of Australia. We don't want to be doing anything to help them to be elected, nor do they want to do anything to help us to be elected. And so it's perfectly understandable why these issues will be resolved in time by the state divisions of the Liberal Party.
So if the real policy of winning the election means you have to preference one nation ahead of Labor in some circumstances, so be it?
Well, I'm not going to be drawn on that, Tom, because it's not my job as an individual for the state of Victoria and the Liberal Party to decide on behalf of all of my colleagues and nationally where our preferences to go. Appropriately, the state divisions will make their own decisions for that. But I do strongly endorse the Prime Minister's decision that they'll be engaging in no preference deals with one nation. I think that's a prudent and sensible thing to do, given what a mess they have been over the last few years, particularly with their failure to select candidates carefully.
If it is, though, up to the states on this, how can the Prime Minister say, no, there'll be no deals, so ruling out one thing for the states to do, but then not going further and deciding where one nation would be preferenced?
Well, I don't think it's necessary for the Prime Minister to get involved in preference negotiations in every of the 100.
But he's already said no preference deals. So involved, but then not going all the way.
What the Prime Minister's rightly doing is at the national level setting clear his expectations that there are to be no deals with one nation, as he should, and if it needed to be said, there will be no deals with the Greens either. He's setting that expectation clear at the national level. Beyond that, it is up to the state divisions to put into effect the Prime Minister's decision on that and to work out in each of the 151 seats, and the half of the Senate that's up for election will be up for election sometime in May, preferences go from there. It's indeed possible, Tom, in the Senate that because parties only allocate the first 6 preferences, that preferences will not go to the Labor Party, One Nation or the Greens, it will go to other parties.
Indeed, you might just be showing the third way there, James Paterson. Thanks for your time today.
Pleasure, Tom.